Walter Briggs was 87 years old, a veteran of 2 wars. No entourage, no grand entrance, just a frail man with trembling hands carrying a folded flag and wearing a jacket too thin for the December wind. It was Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day. Inside the National Veterans Museum, politicians gave polished speeches beneath waving banners. Crowds applauded. Cameras rolled. Outside, Walter climbed the steps alone, hoping to attend the ceremony honoring people like him. But when he reached the door, a young security guard stopped him. "Do you have a ticket, sir?" He didn't. No ID, none they recognized. "Then I'm sorry. You'll have to leave." They didn't ask who he was. They didn't see the burn scars on his wrist, or the way he clutched that flag like it was the last piece of someone he couldn't afford to forget. So he sat, on the steps, quietly, holding his memories while applause echoed just beyond the glass. A teenager across the street noticed. He filmed it, live, and within hours millions had seen the video. An old man turned away from the very place built to honor him. The outrage came fast, but justice came faster, because one of the viewers happened to recognize Walter's face, not from the news, but from a battlefield long erased from headlines. That viewer was a 4-star general. Moments later, a black SUV pulled up to the museum. The doors didn't open with ceremony, they opened with purpose. The general stepped out, walked past the security guard, and delivered a single devastating order. Shut it down. The ceremony was canceled. The guests were dismissed, because if Walter Briggs wasn't welcome, no one was. Sometimes the people we ignore are the very ones we should be thanking. Sometimes the quietest man in the room carries the weight of history on his shoulders. Where are you watching this from? Under a harsh winter sky, a video began to spread like wildfire across social media. It was short, shaky, and filmed vertically, a clip that looked like just another moment of cruelty in a world too used to watching and moving on. But this one stopped people cold. An elderly man, hunched and wrapped in ragged clothes, was seen kneeling on a snowy roadside. 2 officers stood over him. One barked an order, the other laughed. "Push-ups," the voice demanded. "Come on, let's go, Grandpa." The old man said nothing. He lowered himself into the icy ground bones, trembling breath fogging in the frigid air, and began to move. Slowly, obediently, without protest. That 27-second video exploded online. Within hours, it was shared over 2 million times. On Twitter, the hashtag #Justice for the Old Man surged to the top of trending lists. On Instagram, the clip was reposted by influencers, celebrities, activists. Morning talk shows played it on loop. This is what our society has become. One host asked, visibly shaken, "Humiliating the homeless for sport." Rage swept across the internet. People demanded the officers' names. They demanded accountability. They demanded to know who was this man. The answer was, no one knew. And that only made the fire hotter. The man in the video was silent, passive, nameless. But the way he moved stirred something. Not just sympathy. Recognition. "Did you see that form?" someone commented. "That man's a veteran, no doubt." Another said, "That wasn't desperation. That was discipline." The internet began to fill in the blanks. Sketches of the man popped up in protest signs. A hoodie printed with his image raised funds for shelters. His silence gave way to a roar. America had found its ghost to fight for. What caught most people wasn't just the cruelty. It was the stillness in the man's response. No begging, no anger, just calm, composed compliance. Like he'd been through worse. Like this wasn't his first uniform, nor his first war. What none of the commenters, viewers, or reporters knew was this: the man they were defending had once been a leader of men. A strategist, a warrior, a decorated 4-star general who had disappeared from public life after personal tragedy. He had no need for cameras now, but the camera had found him. Across the country, arguments broke out in break rooms, dorm halls, government offices. Some said it was just another abuse of power. Others said it was staged. A few accused the man of being a grifter. But most people agreed what happened in that video was wrong. 2 officers with authority. 1 man with nothing. And still he held more dignity in that moment than either of them. The police department's response was brief and hollow. "We are aware of the video and conducting an internal review." No apologies, no names, no timelines, just a cold wall of procedure. But outrage doesn't wait. Protesters gathered outside the precinct by morning holding signs. "He could be my father." This is not protection. Do you even know who he is but the truth? No, they didn't. No one did. Attempts to identify the old man failed. No shelter logs matched his face. No hospital records. No fingerprints. It was as if he had no past, only this one moment frozen in pixels. And yet if you slowed the footage frame by frame, there were hints. The posture, the way he aligned his hands, the angle of his descent. All said the same thing to those who knew what to look for: military. High level, habitual training. Not someone broken, but someone trained to never break. And still no one could name him. It was this paradox, his invisibility and his strength, that made the nation obsessed. Artists painted murals. Veterans reposted the video with solemn captions. A retired Marine wrote, "That's not a man who's been forgotten. That's a man who's been watching." And indeed he had. Watching, listening, enduring. Not because he was weak, but because he had chosen the moment to be small so others could reveal who they really were. The clip showed humiliation, but it missed something far more important. The stillness. The calculation. The deliberate choice to kneel, not because he had to, but because he understood what that moment would ignite. America thought it was watching a victim. It wasn't. It was watching a spark. The nation was outraged by what they saw, but they had no idea they were mocking a living legend. 12 hours earlier, this story hadn't yet begun. But now it was about to. 12 hours earlier, on the edge of a sleeping town, buried in snow, a lone figure made his way down a frozen stretch of two-lane road. The storm hadn't let up for hours. Snow piled unevenly on the sidewalks, pushed aside by a plow that hadn't returned. Streetlights buzzed with low electricity flickering over icy patches, as if unsure whether to stay on or give up. Henry Rourke walked with his head down, face half hidden by the raised collar of his patched coat. His breath fogged out in steady bursts. He had waited at the bus stop until the last posted time came and went. After an hour, he stopped checking his watch. He knew how this went. Snowstorms meant delays. Delays meant no bus. And no bus meant walking. The shelter was a 6-mile stretch more if he had to detour around plowed roads. But Henry had walked farther with worse on his back. In one hand, he carried a plastic grocery bag, white, nearly transparent. From use, its stretched handles digging into his knuckles. Inside were a can of beans, a knit scarf with 2 holes, and a faded photograph laminated between worn plastic. Nothing else. No ID, no wallet, no phone. He didn't expect company, which is why the patrol car caught his attention long before it reached him. Its headlights pierced the snowy haze as it rolled in from the far end of the road. Henry didn't turn around. He just moved over to the shoulder, careful not to slip, and kept walking. The cruiser slowed as it neared, then stopped. A door opened. Footsteps. "Evening," a voice called out. Male, early 30s maybe. Clear lungs, clipped tone. Not friendly. Henry stopped. The officer approached, tall, rigid, with the practiced stride of someone who liked being watched. His badge read, "Briggs." "Little late to be out walking, don't you think?" Henry answered without emotion. Bus didn't show. Briggs glanced at the road behind him. "Where you headed?" "Shelter on Grandview. That's 3 miles from here." Henry nodded. "Got ID number, phone, no name, Henry." Full name, silence. A second door opened. Another officer stepped out, thinner, younger, wearing his uniform like it was a costume. He chewed gum with his mouth half open and looked at Henry like he was part of a broken fence. Pike, his name tag said. He didn't speak. He just walked a slow arc around Henry like he was circling a lost dog. Briggs continued. "What's in the bag?" Henry lifted it slightly. "Food, a scarf, a photo." Briggs nodded to Pike. "Check it." Without asking, Pike yanked the bag from Henry's hand. He rifled through it like it was trash. He pulled out the laminated photo and unfolded it. A younger man in uniform. 2 children. A woman smiling beside him, sun on her face. Pike squinted. "This you?" Henry said nothing. "Military." Henry paused. "Used to be." "Which branch does it matter?" Pike smiled. "Not really. Just curious." Briggs leaned in slightly. "Look, Henry, you're not under arrest. But you're out here without ID. No phone, no fixed address. That's already raising red flags. I haven't broken any laws. That's true, Briggs said, but a little cooperation goes a long way. Henry met his gaze. I've cooperated more than you know, Pike laughed. All right then, Grandpa, let's keep it light. How about some push-ups, warm you up a bit? Henry stared. You heard me, Pike added. 10 push-ups. Show us you're fine. Briggs didn't object. Pike pulled out his phone. Just a little video for the precinct chat. No big deal. He smirked, thumb already hovering over record. The red light blinked. Henry placed his bag down gently. He knelt. No resistance, no words, just action. His palms met the frozen pavement. The wind pushed snow across his shoulders. Pike aimed the phone downward, angling for the best shot. Henry began. 1, 2, 3. His form was clean, controlled, elbows and core tight. It wasn't fast, but it wasn't slow. Each push-up was steady, precise, deliberate. 4, 5. Pike whispered, He's actually doing them. Briggs didn't speak. His flashlight remained trained on Henry's back. 6, 7, 8. Henry's breath came out hard, but his arms didn't shake. 9, 10. He paused at the top, then slowly pushed himself into a seated position. He reached for his bag, took the photo back from Pike without comment, and stood. Briggs cleared his throat. You're good to go. Henry nodded, once reached for his bag. But before he could take a second step, Pike cut in. Wait a sec, he said, voice lighter now like he was just remembering something. One more thing. Briggs didn't stop him. Henry turned back slowly, his face unreadable, still standing in the snow like part of it. Pike tilted his head. We just want to make sure you're moving all right. You know, warm blood, steady legs, nothing complicated? Briggs shifted his weight slightly, not disagreeing. Henry didn't respond. He didn't move. He just waited. 2 young officers had stepped out of that car with uniforms and titles, but not to help. They came looking for something to control. They didn't see a man. They saw a target. Their eyes didn't offer help. They measured judgment. Henry Rourke didn't speak. He didn't argue. He just looked at them, at Briggs with his clipped authority, and at Pike with that idle grin still clinging to his face like a smudge that wouldn't wipe off. The snow fell heavier now, sticking to Henry's shoulders, outlining him like chalk on cold pavement. He stood in the harsh glare of the cruiser's headlights, as if under interrogation in the open. Let's do 1 lap around the car, Briggs said, voice casual, as though it were nothing. Quick and simple. Just so we're sure you're not disoriented or hiding something physical. Cold night like this, gotta be cautious, right? Henry said nothing. He didn't nod, didn't move. Pike stepped sideways, putting space between them, arms crossed. Come on, don't tell me you can't do that. I mean, you did the push-ups. His tone was lighter now, almost amused, like they were testing a stray to see if it would roll over. He wasn't asking. He was taunting, daring him. Henry took 1 long breath, then began to walk. He stepped around the cruiser slowly, 1 foot after the other, his boots dragging slightly in the packed snow. The headlights followed him with their wide glow. Briggs stood near the front bumper, Pike near the rear, both watching like referees in a game only they understood. As Henry passed behind the vehicle, Pike leaned toward Briggs and whispered, Kind of surprising, isn't it? Thought he'd fall over. Briggs didn't answer. His jaw stayed tight, his eyes fixed on Henry's movements. The lap ended. Henry stopped exactly where he'd started, facing both of them. No wheezing, no stumble, just stillness. You satisfied? He asked. Briggs didn't like the tone. You think you're funny? He said, stepping forward again. Pike let out a small laugh. Guy's got some grit. Or maybe he just doesn't know when to quit. Briggs's voice flattened. You got an attitude for someone with no ID, no record, no nothing. Henry replied calmly. I have discipline. You just don't recognize it. That hung in the air longer than expected. Pike's smile faded. For a moment, something unspoken passed between the 2 officers. Confusion. Resentment. Neither of them understood why this man, this nobody in tattered clothes, could hold his ground without flinching. It wasn't defiance. It was worse than that. It was control. Not the kind that came from badges or guns. The kind that came from knowing exactly who you are. Briggs tried to reassert control. He pulled his jacket tighter and nodded toward Henry's bag. What else you got in there? I already showed you. Maybe you left something out. Henry didn't move. Put it on the hood, Briggs said, firmer now. Henry placed the bag gently on the cruiser's hood and stepped back. Briggs opened it again, more aggressively this time. Same contents can of bean scarf laminated photo. He held up the photo. This her? He asked, pointing to the woman. Henry didn't answer. Pike glanced over. Wife or daughter? Still no reply. Briggs lowered the photo, set it back. You're not going to tell us anything, are you? I've told you everything that matters, Henry said. Pike scoffed. Right. Which is exactly nothing. Briggs stepped in inches from Henry now. The flashlight still hung at his belt, but his posture had changed. He wasn't assessing. He was provoking. Let me tell you what I see, he said. I see a man who doesn't belong, who's hiding something, who doesn't respect the badge, who thinks walking in a snowstorm at midnight makes him above questioning. Henry didn't blink. No, I think it makes me harder to scare. And that was it. Briggs shifted his stance. He'd lost whatever patience he pretended to have. Pike didn't laugh anymore. They didn't see the posture of a soldier or the eyes of a man who'd mapped war zones, carried classified orders, buried friends under flags. They didn't see decades of leadership of silence earned not from fear, but from battles won and buried. They saw an old man with no name, and it irritated them that he wouldn't fold. Briggs's jaw twitched. If you're going to keep making this hard, maybe we give you something to think about next time. Henry stayed still. Hands on the car, Briggs ordered. And Henry didn't move. He wasn't being aggressive. He just wasn't giving them what they wanted. They looked at him and saw someone to break. But they didn't know that the man in front of them had already been through fire. They had no idea he once held the fate of entire units in his hands. He'd written orders that men followed into gunfire. He'd buried soldiers whose names they couldn't pronounce. And now 2 rookies were testing him like a punching bag. When Henry didn't react the way they wanted, they didn't back off. They escalated. Because that's what people do when they confuse silence for weakness. They'd made a decision. If they couldn't get compliance, they'd give him a lesson. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold remained. A sharp, cutting kind of cold, not from weather, but from the kind of silence that followed humiliation. Henry stood up slowly. No words, no resistance, no signs of injury. He picked up his plastic bag, brushed the slush off his knees, and adjusted the frayed cuff of his sleeve like a man buttoning a uniform before leaving the parade ground. Briggs gave a short nod, more out of reflex than respect. You're good. Henry didn't respond. He didn't look at either of them. He just turned and walked. Pike gave a short laugh, brushing snow off his sleeve. Well, the old guy's got lungs. Briggs didn't reply. He stood there watching the outline of the old man disappear under the street lamp glow. Henry's back was straight. His steps didn't waver. There was no stumble, no bitterness in his stride, only composure. That's what made Briggs uneasy. Something off about him, he muttered. Pike raised an eyebrow. You mean besides the no ID, no phone, no address thing? Briggs frowned. No. I mean the way he held his ground. Didn't beg, didn't try to explain. Like none of this mattered. Pike shrugged. Maybe he's just that broken. Briggs looked down at the wet imprint left in the snow, 2 clean hand marks, 2 knee indentations, and 10 push-up craters. Not messy, almost military. He didn't say what he was thinking. That wasn't the posture of someone broken. That was someone trained to wait. Henry rounded the block corner and vanished from sight. But as he passed under the last flickering streetlight, a small silver glint swung briefly from inside his coat. Pike missed it. Briggs almost did. It was small, oval, beaten, dog tag. The image was gone before he could focus. Back at the cruiser, Pike leaned on the hood. You think he's actually ex-military? Briggs was quiet for a long second. If he is, he's ancient. Retired? Not our problem. Pike gave a dismissive wave. Guy'll be sleeping behind a church wall in 10 minutes. Briggs nodded, but something in his expression stayed unsettled. A few blocks away, Henry moved steadily through the quiet street. The buildings were dark, the sidewalks empty. With every step, the laughter behind him grew more distant, until there was nothing left but the rhythm of his boots and the hum of something waking inside him. He paused near a shuttered pharmacy window and caught his reflection. Just a ragged old man coat, too thin, shoulders too wide for someone supposed to be fragile. But he saw something else. Not the years, not the tired bones, but the stillness. The same stillness he'd once held outside Kabul, waiting in the dark before a mission briefing. The stillness he'd practiced through hostage negotiations, black site extractions, and corridors full of silence disguised as respect. He looked into his own eyes. They hadn't changed. Then he adjusted the collar of his coat, just slightly. Enough to cover the insignia stitched into the inside lining, faded now, but still legible if one knew where to look. He resumed walking. Back at the precinct, the night shift ticked forward like any other. But in the locker room, Briggs stood in front of his locker longer than usual. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way the man looked at him. Or the way he didn't. Pike entered behind him, scrolling through his phone. "Already got 2 likes, he muttered. "Told you this one would get attention." Briggs didn't answer. Across town, behind a locked shelter door, Henry sat quietly on a metal-framed cot, the bag resting beside him. He opened it, took out the photo, smoothed the edges. The woman in the picture had been gone 20 years. The children grown scattered. The man in the center in uniform had disappeared from public life after the last deployment. No press release, no retirement ceremony. Just gone. Until now. They thought they were done with him. But they had no idea they'd just kicked dust onto a buried fuse. And when that fuse burned back into daylight, it wouldn't come with noise. It would come with rank. And a silence they'd have to answer to. The lesson was over. But the consequences hadn't even started. Tomorrow they'd see a face they never expected on the other side of the table. The morning sun cast long lines across the frosted windows of Precinct 12. Inside the main briefing room, rows of uniformed officers shifted in their seats, murmuring with half-curious, half-suspicious glances. A mandatory roll call meeting hadn't been called in months. Whatever this was, it wasn't routine. At the front, Lieutenant Reeves stood with his clipboard, clearly uncomfortable. Behind him, Captain Morales, stern, polished, unreadable, remained silent as he surveyed the room. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Then, the door opened. He didn't walk in quickly. He didn't walk in like he was in a rush to prove anything. He walked in like he belonged there. Henry Rourke stepped into the room wearing a clean-pressed marine dress coat. The buttons gleamed. The medals weren't many, but they were real. The dark wool rested easily on his shoulders, and from the moment he entered the room, shifted. Silence fell, not the respectful kind, but the stunned kind. Pike, seated near the back, froze with a coffee cup half raised to his mouth. Briggs, leaning against the wall near the door, straightened slowly, as if his spine suddenly remembered protocol. Henry didn't look at them. He didn't need to. His eyes scanned the room once, and then he moved forward, step by precise step, toward the front of the room. His boots didn't make a sound on the linoleum, but somehow every step landed like a gavel. Morales was the first to speak. "Gentlemen," he said, voice steady, "this is Colonel Rourke. He'll be serving as an independent advisor on our internal ethics and discipline review board for the next 90 days. The room didn't breathe. Henry gave a crisp nod, enough to acknowledge the rank structure, but not too much to invite questions. Colonel Rourke brings decades of experience in military operations, chain of command reform, and accountability systems, Morales continued. He reports directly to the mayor's office. Directly. Not through the precinct, not through the department. He was above them all. Briggs's throat tightened. Pike blinked like he was trying to recalibrate what he was seeing. The man they'd pushed around in the snow now stood at the front of the room, shoulder to shoulder with their captain, and above him in hierarchy. But Henry said nothing about the night before. He didn't look at Pike. He didn't name names. He didn't even mention it. That somehow was worse. His silence was weightier than any accusation. Morales turned the floor over. "Colonel, if you'd like to say a few words." Henry took one step forward. His voice was clear, not loud, but unshakably calm. "I'm not here to lecture," he said. "I'm not here to police the police. I'm here to observe, to listen, and to evaluate whether this station meets the standard the community expects and deserves." His gaze moved deliberately across the room. Not fast. Not slow. "I believe most people who wear this badge want to do the right thing," he continued. "But intent isn't enough. You're measured by your actions, especially when you think no one is watching." The words landed like cold iron. Briggs dropped his eyes. Pike shifted in his seat. Others leaned forward unsure whether to be impressed or alarmed. Henry gave a small nod, then stepped back. Morales closed the meeting with general announcements. No one remembered a word of them when the room began to clear. Quiet pockets of whispered questions spread like smoke. Did you know who he was? Why didn't anyone recognize him? Was that him? In that video. But no one said it out loud. Not to him. Not yet. Briggs lingered at the edge of the hallway. Pike disappeared as quickly as possible. Lieutenant Reeves muttered something about rescheduling a call. Henry walked past them all without comment. He didn't walk like a victim. He walked like the only adult in the room. The man they had humiliated now outranked them, outclassed them, and worst of all, he never once acknowledged it. And that silence, it wasn't mercy. It was control. Because when you expect retaliation and receive none, that's when the fear truly begins. The story wasn't over. But the roles had already reversed, and no one in that room could pretend otherwise. Next, they'd wonder, what is he really here for, and when will he decide to act? The office was temporary, just an unused file room converted for civilian advisors. A narrow desk, a single lamp, the blinds half closed. No nameplate on the door. But Henry didn't need a nameplate. Everyone already knew who he was now. He stood by the window back to the door, reading over a thin manila folder. His coat was draped over the chair, revealing the starched sleeves of a plain white shirt and the subtle glint of campaign ribbons still pinned neatly above the left pocket. Even off duty, he wore his presence like a uniform. There was a knock. He didn't turn. "Come in." The door opened. Officer April McKenna stepped inside, closing it softly behind her. Mid-40s, sharply cut uniform, a reputation for being calm in chaos, and a voice that rarely wasted words. She stood straight, waiting until he looked at her. When he did, it took her less than a second. Her eyes widened, but not in surprise, more like recognition finally breaking through the fog of disbelief. She spoke quietly. "You were at Firebase Laramie, 2005, Helmand Province." Henry nodded once. She took a slow breath. "My father was Captain Joseph McKenna, Delta Company." Henry closed the folder gently. "McKenna, the one who took a frag across the shoulder and kept calling coordinates. That's the one." There was a beat of silence. 1,000-mile silence. April wasn't blinking. Henry sat down slowly in the chair across from her. He used to tell me a story April said about a commander who never raised his voice, but shut down a full assault with a single call, who ordered a medevac through a dead radio line by using mirror flashes and old-school Morse code. Henry gave a faint smile. "Sometimes the old ways still work. He never said your name. He just called you the man with the silver eyes. Said you were the reason he came home. That half our unit did." Henry looked down for a second, then back up. "I remember your father. He was stubborn. Refused to leave his post until every last private got on that chopper." April's voice softened. He said that night changed him, that he'd seen leadership up close. Real leadership. Another silence passed this time, warmer. April sat down across from him. The desk between them wasn't a barrier anymore. "So why are you here, sir?" she asked. Henry leaned back. "Because the rot isn't just in politics or cities. Sometimes it's in the places where uniforms become shields instead of responsibilities. And people like Briggs and Pike, they're symptoms, not causes." April nodded slowly. "You're not just here to advise, are you?" "No," he said. "I'm here to listen, quietly. Let people think I'm just passing through. Let them talk. And once the truth shows itself, then we act." April didn't hesitate. "I want in." Henry studied her for a moment, then reached into the file and slid it across the desk. "Start here," he said. 3 officers reported anonymous complaints about misconduct. None of them were followed up. 2 have since transferred. 1's gone silent. April opened the file, scanned it, and her brow tightened. "This isn't new. It's just never been connected." "Until now," Henry said. April looked up. "Do you want me to report anything suspicious, I hear?" "No," Henry replied. "I want you to make them think you're not hearing anything at all." She allowed herself a small, dry smile. Understood. They shook hands, not like strangers, not like subordinates, but like soldiers. The man who'd once saved her father had now returned to save something else, and this time she'd be the one watching his back. The man who'd been pushed to the ground was the reason many of them had the privilege to still stand. And now, with a trusted ally by his side, Henry Rourke was done waiting. The investigation would begin, but quietly, relentlessly, because true authority doesn't shout. It listens until it moves. With April at his side, Henry would no longer be working alone. What came next wasn't just observation. It was the beginning of something far more deliberate. The quiet investigation had begun. The door clicked shut with a soft thud. Another officer sat down across from Henry, nervous, unsure if this was a trap or a turning point. April stood quietly in the corner, arms crossed, saying nothing. She didn't have to. Her presence alone signaled safety for the right people and danger for the wrong ones. Henry folded his hands on the table. "Relax, Sergeant. This isn't a disciplinary. I just want to hear what you've seen." The young man nodded stiffly. His badge read, Torres, and the sweat at his collar betrayed more truth than words could. It took him 30 seconds to start. But once he did, it came out in waves. They used to call it tuning the rookies. At first it sounded like hazing, but it wasn't. Briggs would corner probationary officers in the gym locker rooms, ask them if they were loyal or just passing through. If they didn't answer right, he'd pull them off patrol rotation. Say they weren't ready. And Pike Henry asked, tone steady. Torres swallowed. Pike would follow. Record them during stops. Edit the footage. Leak the parts that made them look sloppy. He threatened to make someone disappear from inside their own uniform once. I thought it was a joke. Then the next day that officer filed for mental leave and never came back. Henry nodded once, letting the silence hold. April took a quiet note on a yellow legal pad. Torres shifted. "Sir, I didn't say anything before because back then you were just some guy, no badge, no power. And they were everything." Henry didn't flinch. "I was nobody. I understand." Torres lowered his eyes. And now Henry leaned forward slightly. "Now I'm someone who can make their silence louder than your fear." Torres exhaled. The weight came off his shoulders, one confession at a time. Over the next week, the same scene repeated itself with different names. Officers who had once kept their heads down found their voices in the quiet company of Colonel Rourke. One recalled being forced to falsify a use of force report. Another admitted to overhearing Pike joke about planting evidence if it came down to it. A desk clerk revealed that internal complaints mysteriously disappeared after being handed to Briggs. April kept the records. Henry kept his expressions unreadable, but inside the pieces were forming. Not just misconduct, a pattern, a power structure, an entire second chain of command built on intimidation and loyalty, not law. And worse, some officers had complied not because they agreed, but because they had no other protection. When Henry was a stranger, they laughed behind his back. Now that he sat behind a desk with official clearance, they averted their eyes when passing him in the hall. The same men who once mocked his push-ups in the snow now stood rigid when he entered a room. Not out of respect. Out of fear, that fear was proof of something deeper. Not that Henry had power, but that they'd always known what they did was wrong. They just never expected to be held accountable. In the privacy of his office, Henry laid out the reports across the table like a battlefield map. April stood beside him, eyes narrowed. "They built it quietly," she said. "Whispers, threats, paper trails that vanish." Henry tapped one file. "And we dismantle it the same way. Not loud, just precise." April nodded. "We have enough." Henry looked out the small square window. The sky outside was turning a darker shade of morning gray. Quiet. Still. Not for long. When he was voiceless, they laughed. Now that he could speak, they said nothing, because they knew the next words out of his mouth would change everything. Henry had been listening long enough. It was time for them to listen in return. The silence had served its purpose. Now came the reckoning, and it would be public. The overhead lights in the precinct's main assembly hall hummed quietly. Every chair was filled. Officers in uniform sat shoulder to shoulder, badges gleaming, but expressions clouded. Along the walls, civilian observers from the City Council and Internal Affairs leaned forward, notepads poised. At the front, a long table faced the crowd like a tribunal. And behind that table, standing alone under a pale spotlight, was Henry Rourke. No military coat, no ribbons, just a plain pressed shirt and the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed symbols to speak for him. To his left sat April McKenna, composed and resolute. To his right, a closed folder. Thick. Weighted. Behind him on a screen was the precinct's insignia, silent, unmoving. And at the center of the front row, flanked by two union representatives, sat officers Logan Briggs and Ethan Pike. Briggs's jaw was locked tight. Pike bounced his knee, barely masking the panic with his smirk. Neither wore the arrogance they'd shown in the snow. They knew what was coming. They just didn't know how deep it would cut. Henry stepped forward, opened the folder, and spoke not with volume, but with precision. I was brought into this department not to lecture, not to punish, but to evaluate, to observe. And I did. He looked around the room slowly, methodically, until even those who had looked away now met his gaze. What I found was not just a pattern of misconduct. I found fear, manufactured, distributed, and enforced under the badge. He opened the folder, took out the first page. Officer Briggs. Officer Pike, your names appear in 17 internal reports of intimidation, falsification of incident details, and coercion of fellow officers. That number is based on signed testimonies gathered in the last 8 days. A ripple moved through the room. Here, he said, lifting the page is a sworn statement from Officer Torres, detailing how he was threatened with suspension if he refused to edit his patrol footage to cover for you. He laid the page down, took out another. Here's a corroborated account of an internal complaint that was mysteriously removed from the system, tracked back to the same terminal assigned to Officer Pike. Pike's face turned white. Henry continued each page, dropping like a drumbeat. A complaint from a domestic violence victim whose call logs show she was contacted afterward by a blocked number hours after Officer Briggs took her statement. She withdrew the complaint the next day. A rookie officer who requested a transfer after being told, quote, "You either belong to this team or you'll be eaten by it." Briggs shifted in his seat. "The culture you built here wasn't a mistake," Henry said, voice rising slightly. "It was deliberate, and worse, it was tolerated." He paused, then looked directly at Briggs. "You wore your uniform like a shield, but the shield wasn't to protect the public. It was to protect yourselves." He turned to Pike. "And you used your camera like a weapon, selectively recording what made you look strong and silencing everything else." Pike started to speak. "That's not true." Henry didn't even blink. "You'll have time to respond. Under oath." The room was dead silent. Henry took a final page from the folder, the printout of a blurry still frame. It showed Pike grinning behind a phone lens, and in the foreground on the frozen asphalt was Henry mid-push-up. Somewhere in the crowd, a breath caught. "I said nothing that night," Henry said, holding the photo up. "And that silence let you believe you'd won. But silence is not surrender." He lowered the photo. "Silence is waiting." April rose and handed sealed packets to the IA officials. "These contain supporting documentation, video evidence, and chain of custody confirmations," she said crisply. "All validated." The head of Internal Affairs stood slowly. "Effective immediately. Officers Logan Briggs and Ethan Pike are placed on administrative leave pending full investigation." Briggs stood. "This is a setup." "You're out of line," the IA officer said. Pike's voice cracked. "You think you're untouchable, Rourke. You think this is over." Henry didn't respond to the threat. He turned to the crowd. "This department is better than the fear that's run it. And if you forgot what justice looks like now, you remember." He stepped back. Not another word, not another accusation, just the truth laid bare for all to see. As the crowd began to rise, murmuring in shock and disbelief, Briggs clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. Pike refused to look anyone in the eye. They were escorted out not in cuffs, not yet, but in full view of the very officers they once commanded through fear they had used the badge as armor. But today it couldn't protect them, because under this light truth wasn't just visible, it was blinding. Briggs and Pike had been stripped of power, but not of pride. And the humiliation they now carried was only fueling what came next. Their hatred wasn't finished, it was just waking up. The apartment wasn't home, but it was quiet, clean, and came with locks on every door. After Henry's formal appointment as departmental ethics advisor, the city had arranged temporary housing near the precinct. It was small, sparse, functional, a bed, a desk, and enough space to think. No framed photos, no personal belongings, just silence and structure. Two things he understood better than comfort. The folded paper was tucked halfway under the front door of Henry's rented unit. No postage, no return address, no name, just a blank white envelope slightly damp from morning frost. He noticed it the moment he stepped onto the porch at sunrise, coffee still warm in his hand. His instincts didn't hesitate, years of training resurfacing in the smallest detail. The way it was placed. Centered. Intentional. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he scanned the yard. No footprints in the frost, no tire marks, no distant car idling. Whoever left it had done so with precision. Clean in, clean out. He brought it inside and laid it flat on the kitchen table. April arrived 10 minutes later. She was early, which wasn't unusual, but today she barely got a greeting in before Henry gestured silently toward the envelope. She picked it up carefully. Opened it, a single line handwritten in black ink. "You brought war into our house. We can bring it to yours." Below it a photo. Black and white. Slightly out of focus, but clear enough. It was of a woman and two children, Henry's daughter, his grandchildren, in a public park 2 towns over laughing near a fountain. The photo had been taken from a distance, not recent, but recent enough. April's face tightened. They know. Henry nodded slowly, jaw locked. She dropped into a chair. "It's Briggs." Henry didn't answer, but his silence confirmed it. "They can't touch you directly," she said. "But this is the kind of threat that doesn't need a second warning." He finally sat, took a breath. Then another. "You told me once you built everything on control," April said. "But this isn't something you can out-discipline. This is personal." Henry leaned forward. "Which is exactly why we handle it like a mission, not a reaction." He pulled a file from a locked drawer. Inside security rotation schedules, personnel contacts, and a list of off-grid safe houses, most from a life April hadn't fully realized he still had access to. "You kept all this?" she asked. "I never stopped keeping it." They got to work. By midday, Henry's daughter and her 2 children were moved to a secure location, quiet, guarded, and known only to 3 people. April oversaw logistics. Henry coordinated directly with a retired Marine-turned-private operative who owed him a debt from years ago. No emails. No calls. Every message was hand-delivered or encrypted and burned after reading. April handled the misdirection, making it look like Henry's family had left town for unrelated reasons. Social media vanished, devices powered down, the illusion of distance while safety moved closer. Back at the precinct, Henry's presence changed. Not colder, but more deliberate. His words were fewer, his steps sharper. Officers noticed. He hadn't mentioned the threat to anyone else, not even Morales. But rumors moved faster than bulletins. Someone had spotted him speaking to private security. Someone else noticed April had requested leave hours she never usually took. And for all the silence Henry had given Briggs and Pike in that briefing room, the threat on his doorstep confirmed what he already knew. They weren't finished. They weren't just bruised. They were plotting. They were afraid, but that fear had curdled into desperation. Later that evening, Henry stood in the same briefing room, empty now the lights dimmed. April joined him, arms crossed. "Morales is still asking why you haven't filed a formal complaint," she said. "I don't need one," Henry replied. "You know if something happens, it won't." April didn't push further. She just looked at him for a moment, as if weighing something heavier than protocol. "Why do you think they came at you like this?" she finally asked. Henry's voice was low. "Because they thought silence meant I had no reach. They thought if I wasn't shouting, I wasn't preparing. They mistook quiet for weakness." April nodded. "And when they realized it wasn't?" "They panicked." He stepped closer to the whiteboard they'd once used to map misconduct patterns. He erased a name, replaced it with a red marker. April raised an eyebrow. "That's not just a list anymore." "No," Henry said. "It's a target sequence. They tried to shake him. They failed. So they turned to his family. But that was the last mistake they'd make in the dark. Because now Henry wasn't just playing defense. He was hunting. They pushed him to silence, now that silence was pushing back. And what came next was not mercy. It was strategy. He had secured what mattered most. Now he would dismantle what they thought couldn't be touched. It was time to strike back. And this time he wouldn't wait for them to come to him. Henry would hunt in silence, but now with eyes everywhere. The surveillance system had been old, outdated, underused, and mostly cosmetic. But under Henry's direction, it became something else entirely. April called it the net. It didn't look like much, just a quiet string of access logs, room entry records, badge swipes, and hallway footage. No audio, no obvious flags, nothing that drew attention to itself. But that was the point. While the precinct moved like business as usual, Henry and a small team worked from a separate terminal hidden 2 floors down in a storage room no one visited, unless ordered. They didn't speak much, didn't make announcements. They watched. They waited. What began as a passive collection effort soon took shape. First a pattern: 2 patrol officers, Mason and Delaney, were meeting off-record with an unnamed civilian every Thursday just outside precinct boundaries. Delaney had once been Pike's training officer. Mason had been written up twice for failure to report body cam discrepancies, but had never faced suspension. Second unusual activity on the department's internal complaint server: someone was running keyword filters through old archive folders, search terms like Rourke reinstatement clause and discredit. Third, a mailroom tech flagged an envelope reroute, an anonymous package labeled as administrative documents, redirected from the chief's inbox to a back-channel contact with a private security firm. The firm was based in the same county where Henry's daughter had been photographed. That was the crack, and Henry didn't patch it. He widened it. "Why not confront them now?" April asked, as they reviewed the log trail for the 3rd time. Henry leaned back. "Because what we have is proof of movement, not structure." She nodded slowly. "You want the network, not just the messengers?" "Exactly." He tapped the board they'd assembled, names in red ink, others in yellow. Dotted lines connecting them. No direct accusations yet. Just behaviors, proximities, frequencies. Beneath it all, time stamps. "We keep letting them think they're invisible," Henry said, "and they'll expose who they trust." By week 2, the net caught a bigger fish. Detective Neil Craddock once thought Neutral was flagged for accessing evidence room logs during off hours. Surveillance showed him removing a small digital drive. 3 hours later, he met with Delaney in a parking structure 2 blocks from the precinct. April froze the footage. That's the same location Pike used to meet his leak source last year. Henry stared at the screen. "Then we know this isn't a new network. It's the same one. Reawakening. Craddock had kept his nose clean for years, but loyalty didn't always leave a paper trail. It showed in choices, in timing, in how quickly someone backed away or leaned in when a new order came. He's not just passing files, April said. He's rebuilding what Briggs lost. Good, Henry replied. Let him. The net stayed silent. It gathered, expanded. Henry didn't act. He let the circle tighten itself. It was April who finally voiced what they were both thinking. They think you're pulling back. Henry nodded. They're wrong. They think you've gone quiet out of fear. They'll see. They think they're building something again. Henry leaned over the desk. But what they're really doing is walking straight into a box I designed. The final confirmation came on a rainy Thursday, an intercepted message sent through a burner email from a precinct IP address. The content was vague, but the timing matched the next council audit, and the subject line read simply, "He needs to be removed." Quietly. April handed Henry the printout. That's not just about your job. Henry looked at it. No, it's about the last card they think they have. He stood, straightened his jacket, and for the first time in 2 weeks he left the surveillance room. In the hallway above the precinct buzzed normally reports coffee-tired banter, but beneath the surface a current had shifted. Officers who once nodded quickly at Henry now avoided his eye. Others stood straighter in his presence. Briggs and Pike had been suspended, but their influence hadn't vanished. It had only gone underground until now. They thought the storm had passed, that Henry Rourke had given them silence and walked away. But what they never saw was that the silence had teeth, and it was listening, and watching, and waiting. The victory they thought they had claimed was the trap he'd been building all along. And now the lines were drawn, the system had been mapped, and the day of reckoning was no longer theoretical. It was on the calendar. And no one in that network had anywhere left to run. It was no longer a matter of if. It was no longer a matter of when. The day had come. And for once, every eye in the room would be watching the same truth unfold without filters, without fear. There were no body cams that day, no private footage, no edited clips to control the story. This time the cameras faced the other way from the press gallery, from the Civilian Oversight Board, from the front row where families of victims once silenced by fear now sat with pens in hand. At the center of it all stood Henry Rourke, not at a podium. At a table. A long table squarely positioned across from Briggs and Pike, both called back to face formal internal charges. Between them sat their legal counsel. Their uniforms had been traded for stiff gray suits and tightened jaws. No badges, no rank insignia. Just the uncomfortable weight of exposure. Behind Henry sat April McKenna and 2 other officers who had spoken up during the investigation. Flanking them were members of Internal Affairs, the city's legal counsel, and representatives from the Civilian Review Board. It was no longer a matter of departmental reputation. It was public trust, and today the room would choose who it believed. The board chair, an older man with a steady voice, leaned into his mic. Colonel Rourke, you may proceed with your findings. Henry didn't clear his throat, didn't adjust his papers. He simply opened a thin black folder and began. During the last 35 days, we conducted a silent investigation into the conduct of Officers Logan Briggs and Ethan Pike, as well as individuals known to be operating in cooperation with them. He tapped the first document. This is a log of off-record meetings between Officer Pike and a known private security firm used in previous intimidation cases. Those meetings coincided directly with threats made toward my family, one of which was documented in this letter, submitted to evidence. A printed image appeared on the overhead screen. You brought war into our house. We can bring it to yours. A hush swept across the room, the same hush that happens when people stop pretending not to care. Henry didn't pause. This, he continued, is internal badge access data showing Officer Briggs entered the evidence room off hours, unauthorized on 4 separate nights. These nights align with data transfers captured on security footage and tracked through precinct routers. He clicked to the next slide. Time-stamped footage, email printouts, highlighted names, chain of custody. No drama, just structure. Evidence laid out like scaffolding building toward collapse. This is a sworn affidavit from Officer Neil Craddock, Henry said, nodding toward the far corner of the room, who admitted to delivering encrypted drives on behalf of Briggs under threats to his family's safety. He believed he was protecting them. He now understands he was just another part of the machine. Craddock didn't look up, but his presence in the room was enough. Henry placed his final document on the table, a list, names, not all redacted. Each of these individuals has in some way contributed to a network of suppression manipulation and internal sabotage. Some knowingly, some under pressure. None of them acted without the enabling power structure built by Briggs and Pike. He folded his hands. I'm not asking for revenge. I'm not seeking to humiliate. I'm asking that the system remember what it was built for. Silence again. But this one was different. It wasn't confusion. It was reckoning. Across the table, Pike leaned forward suddenly, a voice strained. None of that proves we broke the law. Henry didn't flinch. You didn't just break laws, you broke people. And the law is finally looking back. Briggs spoke for the first time. You think this is over? You think cleaning up a few files changes what we built? Henry met his gaze, steady as stone. No, but it's enough to tear it down. The review board chair cleared his throat. Thank you, Colonel Rourke. The panel will now deliberate on the recommendation for disciplinary action and possible criminal referral. Henry stood, collected his file, and nodded to April. No gloating, no final jab. He'd already delivered the only thing that mattered. The truth. 2 hours later, the verdict came down. Effective immediately, Briggs and Pike were stripped of all departmental privileges. Their badges were permanently revoked. A criminal investigation would proceed under state oversight. The press cameras clicked furiously. Words like corruption ring and retaliation network filled the headlines. But Henry wasn't in the room anymore. He didn't need to be. Outside the building, Briggs stepped into the raincoat collar pulled high. Pike trailed behind, face pale, jaw tight. This isn't the end, Briggs said, voice barely audible under the storm. He thinks he won. But men like him, quiet men, always have something to lose. Pike didn't reply, but his silence said everything. Henry never raised his voice. He didn't need to, because when the truth is loud enough, even the silence becomes a verdict. Briggs and Pike had been removed, but the storm behind their eyes hadn't passed. It wasn't over. Not yet, and Henry knew better than anyone when a man's pride is shattered in public, his next move is rarely rational, but always dangerous. Years passed. The storm passed, too. Quietly, not with a fight, but with consequence. Briggs had tried to move out of state under a false name. Pike attempted one last digital breach, an act of desperation caught before it caused harm. Both were eventually silenced, not by force, but by the weight of exposure and the quiet reach of justice. No trial could give back what they'd broken, but what came afterward made sure they'd never touch it again. Henry never spoke of it. He didn't need to. The town knew, the system remembered, the story moved on. It didn't begin in a courtroom or a precinct hallway. This time it began in a classroom. The room was small, sun-warmed, and smelled faintly of old books and dry erase markers. Paper timelines of American wars lined the walls, most yellowing at the edges, reused each year for History Week. April McKenna sat in the back row now. No uniform, no badge, just a weathered sweater and a quiet patience that came from a different kind of service. She hadn't expected much from the student presentations. Most read facts from note cards nervously reciting battles and names that no longer meant anything to them. But then a boy walked up. No slideshow, no index cards, just one printout taped to a cardboard display. A black and white image, faded, pixelated. An old man caught mid-push-up in the snow. The class snickered. Some didn't understand what they were seeing. But then the boy spoke. He didn't shout. He didn't fight back. But he won anyway. The room grew still. He was old. He didn't have a house. Some people laughed at him because they thought he was nothing. One night they made him do push-ups in the freezing cold just because they could. April tilted forward her breath, halting for a second. They said he was no one. But the next day he walked into the same building wearing medals. Quiet. Calm. And everyone who laughed had to look him in the eye. He paused, then added softly, and after that, things started changing. A student near the front raised a hand. Was he a soldier? The boy nodded. Yeah, but not just in war, in life. He didn't punish anyone. He just made them remember what a badge was supposed to mean. The teacher stepped in. Do you remember his name? The boy hesitated, then shook his head. I don't need to. April looked at him, then truly looked, the curve of his chin, the quiet confidence. And she knew. Henry's grandson. When the bell rang and the room cleared, April waited. The boy was carefully folding his board. She knelt beside him. He was your grandfather. He looked surprised. Then smiled. My mom told me not to make a big deal of it. He didn't like that. April smiled too. No, he didn't. She says he didn't leave behind a name. He left behind a reason. April nodded. That's more than enough. Outside, the world had moved on, but something in the town had stayed changed. The precinct, now under new leadership, carried different energy. Younger officers asked more questions. The community came in not just to file complaints, but to volunteer to connect. April had long since left the force, but the echoes of that winter remained. No more silent halls, no more fear behind every closed door, and Henry was gone. No one knew exactly where. Maybe back to the coast, maybe to nowhere in particular. But his absence was never emptiness. His silence still taught. Some legends are carved in granite. Others are whispered into classrooms drawn in chalk, passed from one child to another. Henry Rourke never asked to be remembered. He simply chose not to be ignored. He didn't leave a title. He left a standard. He didn't leave a statue. He left a question. What will you do when no one is looking? And long after the threats faded. That question remained. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the clouds still hung low over the hills, quiet, unmoving, as if the sky itself had paused out of respect. April McKenna stood at the edge of Section 34, in the veteran cemetery coat pulled tight around her shoulders, boots pressed into soft earth. The rows of white headstones stretched in every direction, uniform, anonymous, solemn. But one marker stood out not for its size, but for its simplicity. No ranks, no war listed, no commendations, just Henry Rourke 1939, 20XX. He never stood behind. That was it. No medal count, no service branch. Just a phrase. But April knew, and so did everyone else gathered there, that the words carried more weight than any title could. The ceremony hadn't been planned in advance. It started with a few phone calls, one from Officer Morales, one from the superintendent of the town's school, one from Henry's old unit, long retired but never distant. There were no speeches from generals, no official salutes. Instead, they came as civilians, quietly, from every corner of the town. A former rookie officer, once intimidated into silence, now a sergeant, placed a folded paper beside the stone. A copy of the internal reforms Henry had helped push through. The local librarian left a worn-out copy of The Art of War. Henry's favorite copy checked out 15 times under a pseudonym no one questioned. and at the back of the crowd, holding the hand of a boy no older than 10, stood Henry's daughter. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just nodded once toward April. A knowing nod. April approached the headstone slowly. She didn't kneel. She didn't bring flowers. Instead, she stood just as Henry always had, even when he had been knocked down, even when he had been ordered to the ground, hands in snow spine aching from age and memory. Even then, he hadn't been behind anyone. He'd been ahead. The crowd began to thin after a while, scattering back to lives Henry had helped shape without fanfare. No one stayed for long. That's how he would have wanted it, no long goodbyes. Just clarity. Purpose. April stayed. One last time. She placed her hand gently on the stone. You never stopped watching, did you? The wind answered for him. A soft current, nothing more. She remembered the way he would walk into a room, not as a superior, not as a commander, but as someone who had already measured the walls, found the exits, and chosen to stand exactly where others wouldn't. He had once told her in the quietest moment after exposing Pike and Briggs, "You don't lead by standing behind. You lead by standing where it hurts most." And he had, time and time again. Not just in war, but in peace. In offices, in silence, in snow. She turned to leave, but paused when she noticed something tucked beneath a small rock at the base of the headstone. She bent down, pulled it out, a crayon drawing smudged at the corners. It was of a man in a long coat standing in front of a group of children. Behind him, 2 officers stood frozen in place, unsure, faceless. The caption, written in a child's uneven hand, read, "He made them stop. So we could start." April closed her eyes. That was the legacy, not the medals, not the titles, but the space he created for others to rise. Henry Rourke never asked to be at the front, but he refused to be in the back. And when he was pushed down, he rose not just for himself, but for everyone who'd ever been told to kneel. He left quietly. But he changed everything. And even now, long after his boots stopped echoing in the hallways, he once walked, his stand remains. Unmoved, unshaken, unforgotten, because some men don't lead by title. They lead by presence. And Henry Rourke was never the kind of man who stood behind. Some people spend their whole lives demanding to be seen. Henry Rourke spent his life choosing when to be visible and when to stand in silence so others could finally be heard. He never asked for a parade, never wrote a memoir, but in one quiet act in the freezing dark when no one else would have blamed him for walking away, he chose to kneel and rise not in anger but in purpose. This wasn't just the story of a veteran. It was the story of a man who showed us what dignity looks like when no one is watching. So now we ask you, when the moment comes, will you be the one who stands up even when no one else does? If this story moved you, taught you something, or simply reminded you of someone who made a difference, quietly leave a comment and share their name. Let their story be remembered too. And if you believe more people need to hear stories like Henry's, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, because sometimes all it takes is one person to stand so others never have to fall.